Is it on now? Okay. Sorry about that. Once again, Nehemiah chapter 5. And we'll cover verses 14 to 19 today. But just so that we can hit the ground running, let's backtrack a little bit, all the way to chapter 1 since Jerry's here. Let's start all over again. Just to the beginning of chapter 5. So last week we saw that the work had ceased. Up until that point, many things had occurred, but the people were working diligently to build up the wall. Yet last week the work stopped, not because the wall was not being built correctly, and it wasn't because the enemies were plotting a different type of attack. It was simply because there was something happening within the community of the Jews. It was a problem from within. And many complaints were brought forth to Nehemiah. People were complaining that they did not have enough money to feed their many offspring, possibly because they were working very diligently in the wall and did not have enough time to do their other types of jobs, and the economy wasn't very good, and they were being taxed, and there was a famine on top of all of that. So many issues, many problems, many variables contained in the situation that they were in. And out of all of those things, when they were being brought to Nehemiah, he evaluated them all, and the text tells us that he became very angry, but he became very angry at one particular thing, and that was greed. He noticed that the rulers and the nobles, they were quote-unquote helping out the poor, which were the majority of the people, by lending them money so they could survive, but they were also charging interest. So they were taking advantage of this situation that they were in. And Nehemiah went ahead and admonished them. He told them that that was a big no-no. And I made the argument that the reason why Nehemiah proposed that as the root of the problem, it was because, in fact, the reason why the Jews were sent to exile in the first place, it was because of greed. It was because they did not allow the Holy Land to rest in particular periods of times, and God said, okay, you will go to exile and the land will rest. And along those lines also, there were certain things in the Bible and in the law pertaining to releasing liabilities, financial liabilities every once in a while. And here it was a wonderful opportunity for the Jews to practice that, to give the money back to those who were charged interest, to release the slaves. It got to the point even when people, they couldn't pay off their debts, they were even sending off their kids as servants or as slaves to these nobles and these rich people. And now, again, through Nehemiah's correction, all of that was being undone. And as we move forward to chapter 5, now we have a particular portion of this chapter, the remaining part of this chapter, where Nehemiah gives his example, what he was doing in a positive manner, and things that should be mimicked, should be copied, should be utilized as a proper way to conduct business. So let's go ahead and read through those verses. Again, I'll read from verse 14 to verse 19. And it says there, moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the governor's provisions. But the former governors who were before me laid burdens on the people and took from them bread and wine, beside 40 shekels of silver. Yes, even their servants bore rule over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. Indeed, I also continued the work on this wall, and we did not buy any land. All my servants were gathered there for the work. And at my table were 150 Jews and rulers, besides those who came to us from the nations around us. Now that which was prepared daily was 1 ox and 6 choice sheep. Also fowl were prepared for me, and once every 10 days an abundance of all kinds of wine. Yet in spite of this, I did not demand the governor's provisions, because the bondage was heavy on this people. Remember me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. Part of the reason, actually the main reason why I did not include this portion of chapter 5 into last week's sermon, it's because there is a definite change here. And I don't know if you've noticed, there is a change in time frame. Up until this point, for a couple of chapters, we've essentially been experiencing day by day what Nehemiah and the people were experiencing. Essentially, the story has been, we've been following the story in more or less real time. It's been a little less than 2 months. And every so often, there's something significant that happens, and then we are experiencing that step by step. But now there is a pause, and there is a time frame that now Nehemiah is focusing on that goes beyond this real-time trajectory. Notice what he states here on verse 14. Moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, from the 20th year until the 32nd year of King Artaxerxes. So now we're leaving that real time, and we are experiencing an overview of a span of 12 years. Nehemiah is reflecting upon his conduct. As I said, this is an example of, not an exchange, but an example of what he had been doing for 12 years. And that's a pretty long time, especially because what we will see here in the next chapter, the walls, they didn't take very long to be built. Less than 2 months. Yet, Nehemiah's tenure as a leader of this community lasted a lot longer than the time frame that it took for the walls to be built, which goes back to that initial premise that was actually Bob's premise. The walls needed to be built, but the people needed also to be built. The walls took about a couple of months. The people, a little bit longer than a couple of months. And a good way to look and interact with this information, again, we're being given Nehemiah's example, his conduct during all of this period of time. Think of this initially as a politician who is giving a speech at the close of his tenure at his position. So here his term in office has ended, and he has an opportunity to give an overview of the things that he accomplished and what he was all about, again, during this period of 12 years, which is actually interesting because of another reason. Remember in chapter 2, when Nehemiah was interacting with Artaxerxes, and the only question that the king made to Nehemiah was, how long is this going to take, more or less? And Nehemiah proposed an answer. We don't know what that answer was, but for sure it was not 12 years. So for one reason or another, his tenure extended for this long, and again, he had plenty of opportunity to conduct himself in a godly manner, and here we have an overview of that. We know based on these verses that we just read that Nehemiah, he had the right to tax people because of his position as a governor. He even stated that previous governors had done that and had done that in a legitimate way. They weren't doing anything unlawful. They were not doing anything illegal. They were not even doing anything that was not to be expected. They were governors that had this right to tax people, but he, not during a period of 2 months, not even during a period of 2 years, for a period of 12 years, he did not take advantage of this right. We know that much like tax collectors, during this time and times beyond this episode, during Jesus' time, for example, essentially how it worked out, when a tax collector collected these funds went to the emperor or the king, but the tax collector took a cut. So it was to that individual's advantage to collect as much as he could. So if Nehemiah was paid up to what he could have been paid, essentially the people were the ones that would have been paying his salary, because the king would have gotten his cut and that would not have been changed. The people were the ones that would have paid for Nehemiah's cut. And again, we're in a situation where the people are struggling. There is a famine. The economy is going down. Cost of living is going up. People keep on having kids. All of these struggles are happening. And Nehemiah understood that it was not appropriate for him to take advantage of the situation. Nehemiah most likely lived partly off of his own estate. In other words, he was a relatively wealthy man. He was the king's cupbearer. He accumulated wealth during his time in Babylon, and now for this period of time, it is very likely that he is utilizing these funds to live off of, to survive. And during his tenure here, he even mentions that he had the opportunity to make some pretty good deals. Again, we noticed that the lords and the rulers and the rich people, they were taking advantage of the situation. And what was the situation? The people did not have money to survive, so oftentimes they needed to sell off their land, to lease off their property. And then they would take that and essentially keep it, because the people did not have money to pay off these loans. And Nehemiah was doing something similar. He was lending money, but he was not charging interest, but he could have purchased some great property at this particular time. And as you know, the best time is when the market goes down. And this is prime real estate. I think I've mentioned this before, but here again, we're talking about Jerusalem. And one of the best real estate deals is actually in Jerusalem because of how expensive it is. If you go to the Mount of Olives, going in a downward slope, so the Mount of Olives in the Holy Land, it essentially gives you an overview of the city. And as it slopes down, there is this cemetery. Not a particularly nice looking cemetery, but if you base the amount of money that it takes for you to have a plot there based off of square footage, that is probably the most expensive plot of land that you can ever have. And part of the reason for that has to do with the fact that the Jews are obviously expecting the coming of Christ. We are expecting the return of Christ, right? And the idea is that that is where he will initially arise, and they will be the first ones to resurrect. Henceforth, why that, plot of land is so expensive. But all of that to say that Nehemiah, he could have made a killing. Imagine if he would have bought that way back then, how much more he could have had now. Again, he could have taken advantage of that. Many people had done so, but he chose not to. Why? He listed reasons here, and mostly it had to do with the fact that his focus was on the work at hand. He wasn't there to make a profit. He wasn't even there just to build the wall. Again, the wall would be built in a little bit longer, but for the 12 years there, he knew that his work had not finished with the walls, and he continued to do so in a godly manner. Nehemiah also, stated here that he had provisions in abundance. Again, partly based off of the fact that he had resources on his own. And he could have used this surplus to make money. He could have sold it. He could have exchanged it for other goods and other things of value. But instead of doing that, he shared this surplus. And pretty often he had as many as 150 people mooching off of him. And he opened up his home. And what is most impressive is that he did so without any agendas, because he listed there the type of people that he would welcome, and they were Jews. Some of them were foreigners, in other words, non-Jews. Some of them were people of influence and powerful people. They were just unimportant, regular folks. And it seems like it didn't really matter because, again, he did not have this agenda. He was just there willing to help those who needed help or wanted help or just wanted to stop by. But going back to my original premise as far as how we should be looking at this as a politician who, after he is finishing his tenure in his office, now is giving an overview of these successes. Unlike many politicians, not all politicians, here Nehemiah's intent was not to give a speech in hopes for re-election. We know that eventually, after this 12-year tenure, Nehemiah goes back to Babylon, but he actually goes back once again to Jerusalem for a time period. So he's going back and forth. But his intent is not to, again, impress people so he can be reelected to an office. Here, it seems like it's not so much for public view, but actually, quite possibly, this was just part of Nehemiah's personal memoirs. Obviously, Nehemiah kept record and journals of his experience. And based off of how this section ended, and I'll just read that verse again. Remember me, my God, for good according to all that I have done for this people. Here, Nehemiah essentially originally was just talking to God. And probably those journals and those memoirs were utilized after the fact to document this story, but it is likely that that was not Nehemiah's intent, to brag to everyone about everything that he was doing. This was a private conversation that essentially Nehemiah was having with God. And he was just stating everything that had occurred and everything that he had done once more, not because he desired popularity, but he desired the faith clearly. But he desired the favor of God through the fear of God. And we see here, he quite literally states that the reason why he did not take advantage of the situation, it was because he feared the Lord. He desired the favor of God, but not in a sense of trying to barter. I've done something, now give me something in return. No, Lord, I fear you. I respect you. I love you and I love your people. Remember me. Remember all of these things that were done through me in this period of time. But now let's also think about these predecessors of Nehemiah. Again, he quite literally stated that other people were in his position prior to his tenure, and most likely all of these items that Nehemiah did, they were done the opposite way by these other governors. Now, I don't particularly think that these were wretched, horrible, sinful men. They were just as sinful as anyone else, but nothing out of the ordinary. But fact of the matter is, based on their conduct, really isn't much to say about them, which is why we have no information. That's kind of the point, right? Here we're talking about Nehemiah's example. In other words, his legacy. His legacy that lives on till this day. Many others had an opportunity to have a similar type of legacy, but we have no information about them, frankly, because they were no different than anybody else. And even thinking about Nehemiah's challenge here. Within this chapter, as I've stated last week, and we did a brief overview this week, his challenge was to get to the root of the problem. And he understood that the root of the problem, it was greed. These lords, these rulers, they were greedy. And how did they get to this point? Well, the other governors, they kind of did the same thing. So they established this way of living. This was the norm. This was business as usual. No wonder the rulers and the nobles acted in such a fashion. Why? Because the governors that came before, that is how they acted. So that's essentially the example that they had for a very long time. And how long again have they been facing these dilemmas? About 100 years, give or take. This was the way of life. This was the way that leaders carried out their positions of authority. It was normal. And now comes Nehemiah. And he comes to shake things up, to give a better example, to give something different, something counter to the norm, going against the grain. And as we move forward, now getting a little closer to our conclusion here, and again, it's a brief section that we are covering today, so we've already somewhat exhausted the content. But now as we move forward to think about how we can utilize this to apply it to our lives, I want to propose some what-ifs here. So this is speculation alert. But it's good, godly, sound, biblical speculation. But every once in a while, you need it. been 100 years since the exiles went back to their home. They were able to build the temple, not as flashy as it was before, but they were successful. But for whatever reason, they could not build the walls. And we've seen potentially why. Maybe lack of organization. No one really to lead them in a way that Nehemiah was leading them. Definitely, or probably, there's an extra but there. Because of all of the animosity that the people encountered for several different reasons. The neighboring peoples did not want God's people to thrive. And many other factors that we can think of as reasons why up until this point the wall had not been built. But what if the wall had not been built up until this point because God did not want the wall to be built up until this point? Think about that for a second. What if the people were not ready for the wall to be built up until this point? What if that potential blessing would have actually been a curse? If the people remained in their sinful, gritty, ungodly ways? What if a rebuilt wall without rebuilt hearts would have been essentially a pressure cooker that would have exploded, much like other cities, peoples, and civilizations from the past had done and experienced because of, again, the pressure cooker of sin? What if God was saving his people from themselves and pumping the brakes so that they would have time to change their ways? Because again, the security of a wall, the success of a wall, in addition to ungodliness, would have equated to doom, would have equated to disaster. What if this has been happening? Interesting. And the reason why I think this is interesting for us to meditate upon and think about is that oftentimes we spend energy reflecting upon God's lack of interest, God's lack of timeliness, what we are lacking, and why God is not doing what he should be doing right about now. And we think about those things, and we even pray about those things, and we question, why? Why do I lack so much? Why isn't God acting in a favorable manner? Why has this not occurred yet? I'm waiting for this blessing. It is not a sinful thing. It is something that I desire and even something that I need. Why hasn't God acted favorably yet? What is wrong? Maybe that blessing would actually equate to a curse if we receive it in a time that God does not judge it to be the adequate time. Sometimes we have to wait. God is very good at fulfilling his promises, but in his time and not in our time. And he does so, interestingly enough, for our benefit and not his benefit. More speculation here. I think God would much rather just do it and be done with it, as opposed to just hearing us complain over and over again why he is doing or not doing things. But he pumps the brakes and he waits. Oftentimes for our benefit. Because again, only he knows what will actually happen if we receive those supposed blessings in an ungodly time frame. And here again, still part of this speculation. I believe the people of God would have been doomed if after they had experienced the exile, they went back to their homeland and they automatically had all of these blessings and all of this success. They needed to continue to learn, even a little bit through suffering, so that internally they could reach a point of maturity that the temple, that the walls, that their religious system would have actually been beneficial for them and glorifying for God. So once again, the next time you are contemplating God's time frame, think about that for a second. And it's not to say that you are doing anything particularly sinful, which is why you're not receiving a particular blessing. But quite simply, it may not be God's timing. And if it is not God's timing, a supposed blessing can become a curse very quickly. Amen.